Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Henry. My name's Nina Bezichnik. I'm the senior curator here at the museum, and I want to thank you all for being with us, everybody in the auditorium and also folks who may be online, for joining us tonight for this talk by Aruna D'Souza. D'Souza is an incisive writer about art and its power to both reflect social and political histories and lived realities and also to imagine alternative possibilities. And amid all of the entangled tragedies of our current moment, I'm truly grateful for this opportunity to gather together with all of you around art as an agent of transformation in our world. So truly, thank you for being here. I'd like to open our time together by sharing the Henry's land acknowledgement. We at the Henry Art Gallery live and work on the unceded ancestral lands of the Coast Salish peoples and the shared waters of all tribes and bands named and unnamed, including Squamish, Duwamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. The land acknowledgement reminds us of our connections, indebtedness, and responsibilities to the peoples and the more than human kin where we live and work. We invite you to join us in paying respects to elders past, present, and future, and to consider what paying those respects means within the work that we do as individuals and within institutional frameworks. So, tonight's program is part of Art Forward, which is a new public lecture series on contemporary art and ideas that the Henry is co presenting with the University of Washington School of Art, Art History, and Design. And it's co organized by us here at the Henry and faculty in the Division of Art at the university. Art Forward invites field defining artists, writers, and curators to our campus for both a public talk as well as engagement opportunities with UW art students through studio visits, critiques, and group conversation. Supporting and fueling the artistic imagination is more vital than ever, and it's a true privilege to be partnering with our colleagues in the School of Art to do this work. The Art Forward initiative is made possible by many people, and I want to thank Annabelle Gould, Director of the School of Art, Art History, and Design, and the Henry's John S. Benke Director Chris Lewis for believing in and supporting this collaborative initiative. Thank you to my colleagues in the Division of Art, Shangra Majumdar, Helen O'Toole, and Henry Jackson Spiker, as well as Henry Programs Coordinator Tanya Collette B, for their enthusiastic support of this partnership and the planning of this first iteration of our Art Forward program. Shout out to Phil Stye and Harrison Ochang, facilitating tonight's AV and making all the tech run so seamlessly. The Art Forward program is made possible by support from the Floyd and Dolores Jones Endowed Fund for the Arts and the Endowed Program Support Fund in Art. And we're so appreciative for that support. We couldn't be more delighted to be kicking off the Art Forward program with Aruna D'Souza. D'Souza writes about modern and contemporary art, intersectional feminisms, and diasporic aesthetics. Her work appears regularly in 4 columns, the New York Times, and in numerous artist monographs and exhibition catalogues. Her book, Whitewalling, Art, Race, and Protest in 3 Acts, was named one of the best art books of 2018 by the New York Times. Recent editorial projects include Linda Nochlin's Making It Modern, Essays on the Art of the Now, and Lorraine O'Grady's Writing in Space, 1973 to 2018. She co-curated the retrospective Lorraine O'Grady, Both and, at the Brooklyn Museum in 2021. She is the recipient of the 2021 Rabkin Prize for Art Journalism and a 2019 Andy Warhol Foundation Art Writers Grant. She was appointed the Edmond J. Safra Visiting Professor at the National Gallery of Art in 2022 and the W. Corcoran Professor of Social Engagement at the Corcoran School of Art, George Washington University in 2022-2023. Her most recent book, Imperfect Solidarities, was published last year in 2024. So in tonight's program, D'Souza draws from her forthcoming book, Pictures of a New World, in which she considers how art can offer vivid lessons for understanding the histories that brought us to our current social political moment, one of precariousness, uncertainty, and calamity. Through examinations of works by artists including Shazia Sikander, Raven Chacon, and Paul Chan, among others, D'Souza explores the ways in which artists and artworks invite us to imagine new forms of living in the future. And just a couple of bit of practicalities before I hand it over to Aruna. Aruna's going to speak for about an hour. We'll follow it with a brief Q&A for audience questions. And we do invite you to write things down on your note cards if that's helpful to you for your questions. But we'll also have a mic going around if that's more accessible to you. And we just ask that everyone keep their questions short and in question format so we can get to as many folks as possible. And without further ado, please join me in welcoming Aruna D'Souza.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me tonight in this sort of, I guess, introduction to what I am working on at the moment. As I was telling some of the undergraduate students I met with this morning, I started out as an art historian, and I taught for many years, and I did all the stuff you were supposed to do. And at a certain point, I decided that what I wasn't getting enough time to do as a professor was to write, and to write to an audience that went beyond the sort of circle of experts in my field of study. And so I started writing, and I took a very circuitous route to that. But when I came back to writing about art, I took kind of a 4-year break from writing about art so that I could sort of unlearn a lot of my art historian habits, my academic habits of writing. And when I came back to writing about art, I had also sort of spent some time. I'm an immigrant to this country from Canada, which doesn't seem like it should be a that big a cultural difference, but as learned, it really is a huge cultural difference. And I think in that time that I was sort of learning a new way to write, I was also really coming to understand the profound and deeply enmeshed question of race in the United States, starting with the aftermath of the murder of Trayvon Martin. And so when I came back to art writing, I really decided that I didn't want to do it in the way that I had done it before. And I made one decision and one realization. One decision was that I had spent so much of my career as an art historian writing about, um, canonical artists, uh, and that in order to um, make amends, in a sense, for simply reproducing the canon. My first book was on Cezanne, just to give you an idea of how canonical we're talking about. In order to, in a sense, atone or make amends, I realized that it wasn't going to be sufficient to just sprinkle in non-canonical artists along with my writing about canonical artists, but really I had to focus entirely, pay back the debt entirely by turning my attention to mostly to artists of color. And as you know, Black, Indigenous, and other artists of color. And so that was a decision I made very consciously. I don't think I announced it out loud because I just wanted to do it and see if anyone kind of noticed, see if my editors noticed that all the stories I was pitching were, coming from one direction. They obviously did. We had conversations, that was fine. But the realization that I had is that now in this new moment and coming to writing about art from a new sense of myself and myself as a thinker, I really was interested in approaching art not in the traditional form of a critic assessing, acting as expert in relation to the art that I was looking at, but actually in the position of a student, which is it's always been my favorite position. I would be in the classroom as a student for the rest of my life if I could do that. Um, and so I really have approached art writing as a process of seeing what I could learn from the world that the artist creates, from the whether that's formal or conceptual or narratively or whatever it is. And so I tell people, I've always said this since I came back to art writing in 2016, that I'm interested in art that teaches me how to be less of an asshole in the world. Um, and so that was my approach. But as time has gone on, I think I would add another thing that I look to art for, and that has really become, come into focus for me, especially in the last few years, that I'm looking at art for lessons on how to survive this world, especially as this world starts to feel less and less survivable. And as I have been writing about art, often approached, I write about art in various locations, but I'm often approached by artists or by art galleries to write about artists, many of whom I know, some of whom I'm learning about for the first time. And what I've noticed, I'm hoping not too many other people have noticed this because then it turns me into a one-trick pony. But what I've noticed is that I tend to have a very strong um, there's a thread that runs through a lot of my writing about artists, and that is how what is there a way of, is there an ethics being proposed in the art that I'm looking at? There's obviously an aesthetic argument, there may be a political argument, but is there an ethical argument as well? And as the time has developed and as, our world is changing and especially, changing so quickly, I started developing the idea for a book called Pictures for a New World. And the title really is meant to, as you'll notice, not all of the artists that I'll talk about are making pictures in the classical sense. There some of them are making sculpture or installation or video or sound. But what I think they are doing is creating pictures for what a world could be in various means. And so that's what I'm really thinking about now. And that's what I'd like to talk to you about today. And we'll see how that goes. We'll see if you're convinced by any of it. But at the very least, you'll, I think, see some work by some pretty amazing artists. So, one of the artists that I have been really thinking about a lot over the last few years, and I've been in, uh, a pretty sustained conversation with, is Shazia Sikandar. Shazia Sikandar was born and trained in Pakistan. And in Pakistan, she trained in um, Mughal miniature painting, right? Meaning manuscript painting that developed in the Mughal era, and the techniques techniques of composition, of applying paint to the surface. All of these things are very, there are very few people who practice this anymore. And she trained with some of the, continuing masters of the technique in Pakistan, and came to the US in 1992 to continue and do a master's degree. And she ended up doing the master's degree at RISD. And became known very early on. This is a kind of um, moment of sort of the multicultural moment in contemporary art, right? So where people are starting to think about identity and, expanding the normalized identities for artists. And so you see a lot of different people that are now, sort of very famous artists come up during that time. And she was making miniature works, these sort of in the miniature style, but works that were spoke to contemporary subjects, right? And so she became very known for this. But she was also, by the early 2000s, starting to work in computer animation, and at a pretty early moment, working in computer animation, working in a bunch of other mediums beyond this miniature painting. But for many years, I think was stereotyped as like the miniaturist, right? The person doing this specific kind of painting. But one of the things that's always interested me about Shazia's work is the way that she has resisted, consistently resisted, the usual interpretation of her work as East meets West, right? Like that's how everyone wants to talk about her. She's taking these contemporary subjects and applying this historical Indian style to them, and so therefore it's East meets West. And and as I've come to understand that her resistance to that idea of East meets West is, first of all, the assumption that contemporary subjects are Western, right? That the contemporary belongs to the West, right? As if there is not a South Asian contemporary, right? Which obviously we know there is, but also that somehow it assumes that her work is a kind of creating a kind of hybridized synthesis, right, of East and West. And and so I just want to talk to you about a couple of her video projects because I think they're really pretty interesting to me, in terms of some very contemporary problems. So what I'm showing to you right now is it's a film still of, or it's a still of the video that I'll show you a little in more fully in a moment. But on the right is a picture from the 18th century, um, made in what's called the company style of painting. So, the British uh, East India Company sort of basically colonized India, and set up, extracted, goods, resources, um, wealth, money from India, and they had their cadres of company men, who were sort of merchant soldiers, I guess is how you would call them. They were there to administer this trade monopoly that they had established in India, and it was the first it was the initial kind of lever or wedge of a sort of total colonization of India by the British Raj, the British monarchy later on as time went on. And so during this period, you see some really interesting kind of artistic developments, a lot of which have to do with, a lot of which involved artists, um, you know, uh, highly skilled Indian artists being commissioned to do works that also adopted English subject matters and styles, right? So the company men would want a company man would want a portrait of himself, and so you see this portrait in which he stands, in profile with his Indian boy servant next to him carrying his gun. And the style here is drawn very heavily from precisely from Mughal miniature painting, this sort of, very identifiable South Asian painting style. But then there are these elements, obviously, beyond, the man himself and his suit. If you look at the leaves on the trees, for example, it's a very English style of 18th century English style of painting leaves on trees, right? And so here you have this sort of image that really, is encodes within it this sort of history of colonization. Um, and this figure of the company man shows up over and over again in Shazia Sekander's work. She uses him extensively, but what she does with him is particularly interesting to me. So, we are living in this moment. I mean, it's sort of, I feel like it's not fashionable anymore to talk about neoliberalism, but we're living in this moment where, um, there's all sorts of things happening in the federal government, right? Due to this current administration. And I feel like we're all in this point of like, wishing we could go back to neoliberalism, right? So I'm here, and so I'm here to remind us all that neoliberalism also has its problems, right? And we could think bigger than that in terms of how we want to imagine, an escape from the terrible time that we're living through now. But there was in the 90s, there was this very classic book that was written. It's terrible. It's like, I call it like, pop economics, right? And written by Tom Friedman, called The Earth is Flat. And Tom Friedman he's a columnist for the New York Times. And he wrote this book. He went to India for like 2 weeks. He went to Bangalore, and he came back, and he was like, I have the total theory of I know, of how the world works and how it should work. And his description of the world was that the world is flat, meaning capital can now skate across a flat earth, right? There's they can, you can do work in a call center in India, or you can code in Singapore, and you can manufacture the goods in China, and you can do this and you can do that, and there's no borders for things, right? Um, and that he felt like this fact that the earth was now flat, and capital could move freely, right, frictionless, without friction. He felt that that was going to create peace and prosperity in the land. That was, there would be no incentive for war. There would be no incentive for, for countries to go to war anymore, because now, if Apple was in the United States and China, then Apple would ensure that the United States and China would never go to war. So we all know how that has turned out, right? Like, but what was equally problematic about this theory was that it did not, and about neoliberalism generally, like, I think in a way it was a kind of good description about what neoliberals were hoping to achieve. But what was left out of this description was the fact that neoliberalism depends on people being held in place, right? People have to be held within borders, because, they need it. Neoliberalism depends on some people being paid poverty wages, while other people reap the profits, right? And so you can't outsource your clothing manufacturing to Bangladesh if Bangladeshi workers are getting paid the same as American workers, right? It requires you keeping those Bangladeshi workers making less than subsistent wages, right? That's how neoliberalism works, right? And so the borders for people and the borders for things are very different, right? And it's always interesting to me when I talk to an artist like Shazia, who was like, her work, say, was in the era of these like global biennials, right? She was a poster child for this multicultural moment. Her work was being shown all around the world. The artist Wangechi Mutu, another figure that emerged in the late 90s, early 2000s, was a absolute, her work was a linchpin for some of the most important exhibitions that were happening around the world. Shazia had a Pakistani passport. Wangechi had a Kenyan passport. They could not, either of them, I've interviewed both of them, they could not go to any of the exhibitions that their work was being shown in, because their work could travel, but they could not, right? Um, Capital can move, people cannot, right? And so, part of what I'm interested in is the way in which our art world has been set up according to these neoliberal principles, right? That the work can move, the people cannot. Um, and and Shazia has been, and I call her by her first name. Don't do this if you don't know the female artist, but like, I do it because she's a friend of mine, and it feels weird to use her last name, but Sikander. Um, Shazia sort of has said that, her interest in history is that the history is effectively just an account of the movement of objects and bodies. And so a lot of her work, um, even when it doesn't seem to, is actually thinking about this question of not just the movement, but of the frictions that exist, right, in the world, as opposed to the neoliberal fantasy of frictionless space. What are the frictions? And in her work, I find that she she actually proposes, I think, a sense of an ability to imagine these masses of workers, masses of individuals, masses of people to actually move, right? But also a vision of fragmentation. So against the idea of the smooth skating across the earth, a fragmentation of the world, and of people constantly breaking apart and coming together. And so I just want to show you this video. Okay. So that's a fragment of, or a section of a longer piece, but what I'm interested in that piece is a couple of things. One is the idea of this, not just the breaking apart of the image of the company man, this sort of representative of the first sort of global expansion of capitalism per se, right? The breaking apart of this man, but also the kind of integration of the fragments into these new other forms. That the work is all about this idea of the breaking apart and the coming together, coming back together, and the ways in which those sorts of fragmentations and explosions even result in new configurations, right? Um, uh, One of the themes that runs through Shazia's video work is the idea of the murmuration. Does anyone know what what a murmuration is, right? The idea, have you ever seen it when you've seen, swallows or something fly in the sky, right? And suddenly they start moving in these very choreographed looking, geometrical almost kind of arrangements. And, it'll be hundreds of them, thousands of them moving in the sky as if they're all sharing the same brain, right? Um, and scientists have no idea how they do this other than just pure instinctual whatever. But they come together in this momentary flights and then break apart. And then, maybe they'll come together again in different configurations. It's not always the same flock of birds, right? It may be, you know, thousands of birds who are just coming together for the first time, or, many of them coming together for the first time and then breaking apart. And to me, this idea of the murmuration and the way that it operates in Shazia's work um, seems to me to be a really interesting way of thinking about what a kind of what a kind of uh, solidarity might look like in terms of a kind of what solidarity might look like when we are finally able to understand ourselves as part of a sort of as part of the masses, as part of a global kind of movement of people that extends beyond borders, and I think in that sense, very much in line with what a lot of third world feminists in the 70s and early 80s were thinking about. Um, and so, I just, so I'm going to show you now this piece called Reckoning. I might need help with this one. Ah, thank you. Oops. Oop. Now I can get it to work all the time. Thank you. Wait, sorry, I need the next. Here we go. Okay, I'm just turning to the next slide so that I can not have the music going. But anyway, the music in her videos is in these two videos is composed by Yu Din, who's a Pulitzer Prize winning composer that she collaborates with a lot. But one of the things that you saw in that video is the way in which that you have this amorphous, these two warriors, and you first they're sort of amorphous and warped and whatever, and then you sort of eventually see them. And those two figures again are sort of figures from a famous Mughal painting, and so that she's actually taken. But, so for me, the for me, what's interesting in Shazia's work is that in the face of globalization's celebration of frictionlessness, she her work, which has long been interested in questions of migration and diaspora, has offered up a vision of friction and of fragmentation and of disintegration, a picture of what globalization has meant for contemporary subjects. So that's, the subjects in globalization, that's what their experience is, not the frictionlessness, but precisely the friction, fragmentation, disintegration. But at the same time, uh, y- you know, even as our faith hopefully neoliberalism, well, I shouldn't say our faith in neoliberalism has worn away, because I think that really, the problem is that we're stuck between a rock and a hard place right now. But that in the face of that, I think what her work proposes through this idea of murmuration, of fragmentation that can come together in these momentary moments, allows us to think through what new forms of solidarity might look like not a perpetual identification with others, but a momentary coming together in these, around um, around certain moments, around certain questions, around certain needs, that can then separate and go its way and come together again as required. And so that's what Shazia's work is allowing me to think through. Um, the next artist I want to sort of show you work by is the artist and composer Raven Chacon, who is a Navajo Diné artist, who he won the Pulitzer Prize for Music, first Indigenous artist to win the Pulitzer for Music a couple of years ago, and won the MacArthur Prize last year, and I think is making some really amazing work. I'm showing you this, which is a piece that he did as a billboard outside the Whitney Museum during the run of the 2021 two. I'm getting my years mixed up. 2022 Whitney Biennial, um, and but the piece itself is a sound piece that I'll show you in a minute. And this obviously was made in conjunction with the No Dakota Access Pipeline demonstrations in Standing Rock in 2016 and 2017. He went out there in 2017 and collected photographs as well as recordings, because his work is really, a lot of his work is based on site recordings. He also does noise music. He also does music that is music that draws upon and plays with, Western classical music. The Pulitzer Prize was given to him by a uh, for a choral piece that is meant to be performed in churches, right? So he's working across a big range of sound practices, and uh, you know, Raven talks about the score. His work is organized around the idea of the score, right? And the score, of course, is like, in the Western kind of musical tradition, the score is like, you write down what all the different musical parts are doing and how they're relating to each other. And Raven is using the score in a slightly different way. For him, the score is a proposition for being together, right? So the score is actually, he's interested in using the score as a way of proposing how people interact with each other over space and time, and what are the potentials of that. But I'm going to show you or make you listen to the silent choir piece. Um, y- there, don't worry. The sound was working, like you were hearing the piece. Um, he captured an event that took place just after Thanksgiving in 2017, a silent resistance led by the elder women in the encampment of 500 or 600 people who faced down state police and the pipeline's security forces. Instead of the expected din of protest, and surely there was a lot of din of protest, right? Sounds of protest over the course of this long struggle. Here we hear the respiration of the crowds, the occasional surveillance helicopter whirring overhead, the rustling of bodies. This might seem like the interval before or after action, a recouping of energy, perhaps, or a moment of deciding how to proceed, calm and tense by turns. But it is also an action itself. And that seems to me, for me, what makes the piece so beautiful. It's not just a congregation of silent individuals, it is a silent choir, right? That's what he calls it. An ensemble, a group in which multiple people may share a voice and in which multiple voices build a composition. Um, and I think right now, as so many of us are thinking about what constitutes resistance or what constitutes standing up for our beliefs, what constitutes protest, that the idea of silence, right, as a form of protest, I think has so much, it has so much weight to it and gravity to it that I think is really captured by that particular piece. The other piece of Ravens that I'm particularly fascinated with in terms of these questions of how do you imagine, say, forms of solidarity or forms of being together in the world, um, is a piece called Plain Song that he first did in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. On the side when it was displayed on the side of the building. So the score itself is the black and white design that you're seeing on the upper half of that low building on a street in Saskatoon. Visually, it doesn't look much like a musical score in the traditional sense. Rather, it recalls geometric designs used by different Native American cultures, right? Blanket designs, say, or pottery designs. Um, uh, the triangles, the little nested triangles arrayed across a rectangle like bent staves are punctuated by the small black triangles, which function as note heads. So the small black triangles are actually note heads. The title of the piece, Plain Song, reaches in two opposing directions. On the one hand, it's sort of a play on the songs of the Plains Indians, right? And Saskatoon is, part of this, of the prairies or the plains as you say, in the States. And so the Plains Indians were the first people to dwell on the land in that part of Saskatchewan. And it also refers to plain song, which is liturgical chants that were used in the Catholic Church almost exclusively until the 9th century. And they were monophonic, right? So they consisted of a single melody sung or played without harmony or counterpoint. So plain song was just one, so there were no sort of multiple voices. All the voices were singing in one direction, right? One tune. So in this piece, each of the multiple musicians, and the musicians, you see them out here. And I should note that this was a piece that he made during COVID, right? During the COVID pandemic. So one of the reasons that it was designed like this is so that people could be out together during the pandemic, right? So it's outdoors, and I'll just describe what they do and you'll get the sense of why it was arranged that way. In Chacon's piece, each of the multiple musicians play the same score, the same tune, but out of sync. They can start on different notes, and each triangular note head points to a possible next note to play. So you see they're all sort of pointing in different directions. So they're pointing to a possible next note to play. So as each musician moves on to the next note, they must move their body to that position in relation to the painted score, right? But with the following caveat: they must keep a distance from other players, and so they might have to wait before choosing and moving to a new note. So if one musician holds the note particularly long and you're meant to move to that position, you have to wait until the other musician has finished, and then when they move, you can move into the next spot. They might have to play the note they're on for a longer duration in order to make space for others, in order not to take up a position that is not theirs, in order not to displace anyone, that is to say. Among other things, the piece asks us to imagine a form of spatial coexistence and thereby refuse the idea of the occupation of a territory. And to me, knowing how deeply Chacon's work is embedded in, in the history of Native American experience in the U.S., the idea of creating through this score a proposition for moving together in which no one takes over the other person's territory seems particularly compelling, and as a way of conceiving a genuinely, like, I'm not going to say decolonized because I don't think I have enough. I don't. I think I don't have enough kind of devotion to that word to use it in this case, but really an anti-colonial kind of form of moving together in space. This is Ruth Asawa. Ruth Asawa was a sculptor who um, uh, grew up in California, was incarcerated during the Japanese internment during World War II. She, after the war ended, she managed to get admitted to study at Black Mountain College, that very famous art college in North Carolina, where she studied particularly with uh, Albers and Annie Albers, right? So, two of the very famous Bauhaus artists who ended up teaching at Black Mountain College. And she developed a sort of, as she was there, she developed a signature kind of technique. That she developed partly out of her study at Black Mountain College and partly from spending time in Mexico and um, learning, various indigenous forms of basket weaving. But she was working with a wire that she would loop almost like crochet. It wasn't crochet, but it was similar to, so that she could make these three-dimensional forms out of this, single thread of wire. And the forms, as you can see, took on these sort of, organic bulbous shapes, and she often hung them. They were often hung so that they could, they formed these little environment. Often, they were individual works, but they were often installed together, right? And in overlapping ways. So this is just an image of, that I think I took at a show that was at the Pulitzer Foundation some years ago. Anyway, Asawa used to talk about, I've always been really fascinated to read her letters and her writing about here's a person who went through the experience of being in what was essentially a concentration camp, an incarceration camp, um, and during a period and sort of during and after the war, there was a lot of xenophobia about the Japanese, and she experienced a lot of that. And she she has these beautiful letters that she wrote to her future husband, who is another artist who she met at Black Mountain, in which she was sort of trying to explain to him, like, he was a white man. She was trying to explain to him what he would be getting into by marrying a Japanese woman, and what he would have to experience on the street, and how he would have to tolerate watching her be have comments made or be treated badly, and that if he decided to marry her, he couldn't always be fighting the world about her. But when she talked about art and art making, she spoke about it in a way that was that was so fascinating to me, because it was she would talk about it, um, that art allowed her to feel that she was part of everything, sort of part of the universe, as well as feeling like she was uh, part of a community of one, right? So the idea that art and art making would allow her to both connect with everything in the world, but also allow her to retain this singular individuality, right? This paradox of being both part of the world and utterly individual, utterly apart from it. Um, but for her, the mobility of line, right, of this wire, of the line, its ability to go anywhere, was a kind of possibility for her. It offered a kind of invisibility, right? An invisibility that she kind of craved, right? Because she felt so visible on the street in the world as a Japanese American woman. So it was akin to being a person so inconsequential she can enter any space unnoticed, right? Um, it was fully mobile. And this transparency, formed by the line's ability to slip through space and still function as a boundary, was imagined by Asawa as a model to model an almost human form of coexistence, one in which space, or even that which fills the space, which is air, is not consumed or occupied, but simply borrowed momentarily. And she wrote, I am able to take a wire and go into the air and define the air without stealing it from anyone. A line can enclose and define space while letting the air remain air. You can see right through most of my sculpture, right? And so I find this idea of transparency in the same way I think that I find Raven's kind of proposition about being together and moving with a purpose, all following the same score, without stepping on anyone's toes in in some way. But the idea of being together without stealing anyone's air, and the idea that she's creating this formal device, and these sculptures are really, very formalist sculptures in some way. They really are built out of this specific technique that she developed, that had to do with taking a piece of wire and transforming it into abstract three-dimensional forms. But at the same time, it was also a proposition about how forms can exist, they can overlap, but they don't occlude each other, right? Her sculptures never occlude each other. You can always see through. And she often had herself photographed, or was photographed, with her body covered by the sculptures, because that idea of allowing oneself to be both hidden and visible at the same time was a very powerful, I think, thing in terms of how she negotiated the world. Many of you might have seen Stephanie Saijuko's show at the Fry, right? When did it close? It was last summer, so I don't know how many of you did see that show, but Stephanie is an artist who works, she's in the Bay Area, she teaches at Berkeley, and she's an artist that I've learned a lot from as well, who is working a lot with archives, and archives specifically that deal with the um, American colonization and, both the westward expansion, the settler colonialism of the North American continent, but then also the colonization. America colonized the Philippines, and where she traces her own identity. But her work with the archives is particularly fascinating to me because she is actually consistently in this work asking us to think about uh, not necessarily the experience, or how much this archive reveals about the people being colonized, but in fact asks us to consider the white gaze, the way in which these photographs, or accounts, narrative accounts, written accounts of colonization, right, written by colonists, written by anthropologists, written by scholars of various sorts who went out to the Philippines to sort of record what life was like there, how much they actually reveal about whiteness rather than about, Filipinos, right? And so one of the projects that she does is called Block Out the Sun. It is it's various forms, but it's a slide projection, like, and in it you see her going through the archives and actually blocking out the faces of these Filipino subjects of 19th and early 20th century Filipinos who were photographed by American colonizers for various purposes. And with each shift of the slide, right, as one slide moves to the other, you hear a different form of click from different cameras, different historical types of cameras. So, kind of including contemporary digital ones, phone cameras, whatever, to give a sense of the ways in which these sorts of power moves, right, these ideas of kind of gathering information, of revealing, right, the colonial subject to the colonist's eye, are still subtend the way that we conceive of photography as a medium, right? That photography is a way of capturing, right? Like, I mean, every once in a while I see someone say on my Instagram, "Oh, nice capture," right? Like that's how they refer to my, photographs, and I'm like, "Oh, that's really telling," right? Because photography for so much of its early existence was really about these power relationships. And so here I feel like, Stephanie is doing something really interesting about insisting on the subject being allowed its opacity. In other words, allowing the subject to not be revealed against its will to the white gaze, to the colonizer's gaze. I'm just going to show, I think this will be the last one that I'll show, so there's enough time for questions. This is another artist that I'm immensely fascinated with, the painter Jennifer Packer. Um, Jennifer Packer is an artist who I think is quite brilliant on a lot of levels. One is the level of art historical knowledge and care that she uses to develop her imagery. But the other is the way in which she uses brushwork, again, to resist the easy visual consumption of her subjects by an audience, right? So she uses brushwork as much to pick out detail, reveal things as she does to obscure. In in order to paint what she wants to paint and who she wants to paint, and she's often painting portraits of people very close to her, other Black friends and artists, but at the same time, not allowing themselves to be simply spectacularized or put on display for the viewer. So allowing them to retain a sense of privacy. So this is a portrait. It's actually one of the, or not a portrait, it's a painting, but it's one of the biggest paintings that I think she's ever completed. It's really wall sized. It's monumental. And the title is Blessed Are Those Who Mourn, Breonna Breonna, from 2020. And of course, this was made in response to the murder of Breonna Taylor by police. And the painting is actually, I think, sort of really interesting for the way in which you see certain things delineated with a lot of precision, like the tufting um, on the couch, for example, is done with a lot of precision. The kind of leaves of the plant. Again, the things posted to the walls. There's like little, like I think there's a Spider-Man thing, there's comic book things. And all of these were details that she gleaned from the press photographs of Breonna Taylor's apartment that she sort of put together in these ways that don't often make sense. Like, why is the fan sitting on the stove? Like, there's all sorts of like little things. It's, um, it's less a realistic depiction of the space and more, it seems to me, it gives the air of grieving, the way that you remember sort of weird things about the person you've lost, like little details that are sort of out of context, or why am I focusing on that little detail, that often accompany grief. And so the picture sort of, you know, uh, really does that, I think, throughout, creates this very sort of sense of intimacy, of dreamlike space, a sense of grief and a sense of loss. And the man, I think, is the male figure who is on the couch in the um, uh, those blue basketball shorts. This is a figure that comes out of, any number of art historical sources, right? Renaissance pietas, Girodet's Sleep of Endymion, which is a picture that's actually all about, desire, right? It's all about the sort of luscious male body. Um, Jacques-Louis David's Death of Marat, and the sort of dead martyr in his bathtub, right? Which is also, if you guys have seen A.K. Burns's piece, one of the pieces, there's Marat is a character in one of those pieces, so you can watch that film and see it. But what is missing from this tribute to Breonna Taylor is Breonna Taylor, right? It's a resistance, I think, to the ways in which Black Death is so spectacularized, right? These images of Black Death are so ubiquitous on news channels, on social media, on our social media feeds, everything like that. And here she refuses. She doesn't stop herself from honoring the work, but she refuses that spectacularization by painting, in a sense, around it. At the same time as still allowing it to be allowing a moment of mourning to persist. Here is her tribute to Sandra Bland from 2017, "Say Her Name," which is an offering of flowers. Again, the refusal to reproduce, continually reproduce, the images of Sandra Bland as, in her death. I'm going to skip this and I'm just going to end with this one because I think this is like the thing that I'm thinking about now a lot. So Paul Chan is an artist who has, who kind of came to prominence in the 2000s as both an artist and an activist. Um, and he was making work, a lot of video animations, a lot of he very famously created, when the Republican National Convention was on in New York City, he famously created a free map that people could, that where he had found out as many places as he could. He worked with other activists to find out where Republicans were staying, what hotels they were staying at. They were like calling up hotels and like giving weird stories and getting information about where the Republicans were staying, where the meetings were happening, what hotel conference rooms the meetings were happening, and distributing those maps so that protesters could find where to protest. And so he was making work like that. And around 2010, he decided he didn't want to make art anymore. So he turned around and he said, okay, I'm done making art. And he started a publishing imprint called Badlands Unlimited. And he actually was the publisher of my book, Whitewalling. So that's how I sort of got to know him and his work. But during this period, he was not taking a break from the art world entirely. He was still making art. He was just not showing it very often, and he was working on things that were, many of which were not. He's developed an AI self-portrait, for example, but things where he's actually like learning, advanced mathematics, or doing a lot of writing. But one of the series that he did do during this period, and has started showing more broadly in an exhibition that started at the Walker in 2022 or 23, is this series called, which he calls Breathers. And there are those air dancers, right? Is that the technical term, that outside the car washes and used car dealerships and stuff like that? And he has, he sews them together in ways that allows sort of a fairly choreographed movement, not just random movement, but a fairly choreographed movement that is determined by the way that they're sewn together. And many of them, he's done ones that are all white, for example, which very much suggest the KKK, and that's a running concern in his work, or other groups, and often they're in circles holding hands, which, for those of you who know Matisse's painting The Dance of the Circle of Dancers, it's a very a very strategic kind of reference to that. But they are, for him, he says that they were a way for him to continue animation without looking at a screen. He has long been, and actually has, been trying to get me off social media for years, because, and he's right. He has been saying for years that social media is, it's the biggest form of surveillance, right? That has developed in our time, and it is the means by which we are all surveyed, and that it, and so there's that aspect to it. But he calls them breathers because he is really interested in the idea of um, taking a breather, right? Taking a break. But also the idea that we are too much defined by our productivity, right? And that our value should not come from our productivity, what we can do or what we can make, but simply because of the fact that we breathe, right? That is enough to ensure our worth. And this has been especially on my mind the last couple of days, because I'm not sure how many of you read about um, RFK Jr. Making a speech about autism, people with autism, and saying that, these people will never pay taxes, they'll never hold down a job, they'll never write a poem, um, they'll never, do this or that or the other. And in addition to that being a horribly eugenic comment to make about people with who are different than us, who have different ways of being in the world than I might individually or you might individually. It's also a horrifying understanding of what the worth of an individual is, right? That a person's worth is only determined by what they produce, right? What they can do. Can they pay taxes? Can they write a poem even? The expectation and the demand of all of us as beings to be that is the minimum standard of being understood as human seems to me incredibly oppressive and dystopian. And so every time, when I was reading that, I was really thinking about Paul and about these works and about the insistence, works in the world that insist on human value being located simply in our being beings and not in anything beyond that. Um, so I will leave you with that and hope that you have questions and we can talk more about anything you'd like to know about. Anyway, thank you. So I think there's some. Oh, okay. Okay, this is someone's notes, and I'm not sure that I can come up with an actual question from it. It's beautiful. I'm going to take a photograph of it because it's actually a beautiful like set of notes. But I think that I don't have the capacity to turn it into a question. So whoever this is, it says murmuration and something about Homo sapiens. So anyway, so whoever's that is, thank you. This is great. But how do you feel about marginalized people taking or claiming space in the art world and not giving ugh, and not giving something basic? I can't quite read that last two words. Um, I so I Oh, and not giving it back, I think what that means. So, I have the sense that space isn't finite, right? We know that, right? Like in a sense, like we know that space isn't finite. I think that one of the things that capitalism teaches us is um, that everything is limited, right? That there's a limited supply of everything, and that if I get something, it means you don't get something. If you get something, it means I don't get something. And I think it's a very real thing in the sense that, I think marginalized people in different contexts, right? It's different in Canada than in the States. It's different in the States than in Mexico. It's different in Mexico than it is in India, whatever. I think marginalized people um, are certainly kept out of systems, kept out of systems like the art world in very real ways. And I think that when people manage to claim space within within the mainstream art world, I think it's great. It's great for everyone. It means that all of our minds are expanding. We're seeing more interesting things in museums. We're seeing more we're seeing different points of view. We're learning different things. We're learning different histories. For me, that's all a plus. But I also think that there is something really powerful and I'm just going to turn back to this. I think there's something really powerful about the idea of refusing competition, right? And refusing the idea that that there's only a limited amount of attention or even money or resources or capacity to go around. Um, and so one of the things one of the artists that I'm very interested in is Simone Lee, who is represented the United States at the 2022 Venice Biennale, had the pavilion there, and organized a program called Loophole of Retreat that was in conjunction with her presentation at the Biennale. And one of the things that I've really learned about Simone's work, which is very much involved with, I think she is a sculptor. She's a ceramicist. She is makes, I think, some of the most beautiful and really technically superb ceramics that if you think of the scale and the level of craft here, it's quite extraordinary. But she is also an activist, and I think that she has very much built around herself a kind of understanding of art as a kind of collective practice, in the sense of that it's connected to a field of discourse, and that one must honor that discourse. One must make space for each other, and that one must start from the position of abundance, right? Start from the position that there is that we have enough, whoever the we is, whoever the we you're identifying yourself with, we have enough. And if we learn to build from what we have, we can make the world we want to be. So refusing the ways in which, say, the art market pits, especially people of color, against each other. It's like there can only be, one flavor of the week that we're all focused on, and we can't, it's the way the art market really works. It's the way that art galleries often work. It's the way that museums, which are, it all connects back to the market, right? So, the way that these organizations often work is to pit us against each other, and make people, including white artists, including white male straight artists, right, who have who are now maybe feeling like they don't have enough space. It makes us all feel like if someone gets something, then I don't get it. Without and I think that right now all of our um, all of our responsibility is to create the spaces that we need, not just to support ourselves, but to support each other, right? Out, no matter how much people try to tell us that there's only so much to go around, right? I mean, I certainly think that we should claim whatever resources we can. I think that we should, divert whatever resources we can. I think we should use institutions that have those resources to support the work that we want to see in the world. I absolutely do. But I also know that, you know, I also know that even over the last year and a half, people in Gaza were making art, and I sort of feel like, well, if they can do it, um, certainly we can. I mean, art in the largest, broadest possible sense, certainly we can. That we can insist on it as, our right as, beings to actually be able to um, claim our subjectivity, and part of that claiming of our subjectivity means claiming our creativity as well. I don't know if that answered the question, but that's where I went with it. Sorry. If the note taker wants to tell me what their question was, I'd be happy to answer it. But or if you want your piece of paper back, your notes back, please. Yeah. Okay. Oh, have another question? I saw you raise. That was the question. I got the answer. Okay, great. Okay. Any other questions? Yes.
Thank you so much for this wonderful talk.
Yeah.
My question is about the picture part of your title.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
wanted to ask you to see if you can speak more on that.
Yeah.
And also, how do these artists and artworks produce pictures and your conceptualization of it? And is it at all related to its digital reproduction or how it's being shared in this current time?
So that's really like it's great that you asked that question because it's been like it's actually I came up with the title and then everyone was like, okay, but that title you're not actually all talking about pictures, right? Like you're not, and so I was like, no. And then actually Paul Chan, who still calls himself anytime he phones me, he's like, "Hi, it's your publisher," right? He still considers himself my publisher, even though he shut down the press after my book. He said he said he said he said, I think that he was hoping, publishing is it's impossible to it really is like so difficult to sustain publishing financially, right? Like unless you're producing blockbusters and there's no book about art that's going to be a blockbuster, I'm pretty sure. I'll try, but like, um but anyway, but I was saying like but the title is like it's stuck in me, right? Like it's really hard to get away from. And he said, "Well, but you're not talking about pictures like literal pictures. Like they're not making pictures, right, of this new world, but they're allowing you to picture a new world, right? And that's what they're doing. And so that's why and so I was like, okay, that feels right, right? Like that feels like and I think that and I think that that's the power for me of art is the art that allows me to picture something new. And I think, that's, to me, like someone like Ruth Asawa can do it as much as someone like, Shazia or Jennifer Packer or whatever can do it, right? Like, this idea that like, that all of these people like working in their media, right? Their chosen mediums, working in the studio, working on their craft, thinking through the history of their craft, like, thinking through the formal possibilities of their craft can actually like, help me picture at least, this is very personal, right? But help me picture what the world could be. I think like that is the most extraordinary thing, right? And I think it's like, uh, I went to the hands off protest and and I was looking at the signs and I was so moved, right? Realizing like, like in these moments of like, deep stress, right? Of deep anxiety, of deep anger, of deep whatever, that people still like in whatever capacity they have, like we're not artists making these signs, but there were people who sat down with like markers and were drawing pictures and like, making these signs. And, that's another way of picturing a new world, right? Is like actually like making something. And so, yeah, so that's how that title I'm sticking with it, even if it's not a convincing one, but that's how I'm thinking of it, right? Thank you. Other questions? Have I stunned you all into silence? Don't worry about that.
I'll ask a
Yeah.
question that has more to do with how you approach these artworks as a subject to write about,
Mm,
which is, you talked so beautifully about a lot of the materials and a lot of the actual like making of the work and
mm,
how the yeah the physical and material and formal qualities of the work evince some of these different forms of like social relationship.
mhm,
And also, you talked about your interviews and conversations with artists, and you talked about reading Asawa's letters. And I guess I'm curious, like, what your process is for coming to shape your relationships with the artworks and how you come to write and relate to them.
sure. So, you know, I in the cases, say, of someone like Shazia of Raven, A.K. Burns is going to appear in the book, but I didn't feel like talking about her today because sort of bringing coals to Newcastle or whatever that saying is, right? But those were artists that I spent a lot of time talking with and interviewing and doing studio visits and everything like that. Jennifer Packer, I've never met, but I've read a lot about the work and I've spent a lot of time looking at the work. Um, uh, so it varies across. Ruth Asawa obviously had passed away long before I ever encountered her work. Um, so it's been a really like it's really different in each case, but I guess one thing that I explain, I was telling the students today, I'm a Taurus. And so everything for me is like super material. Like I need to know like how something was made. And so my studio visits are often like, okay, but how did you mix that paint? Or how did you like, what's the what goes on, how do they go on in different layers or whatever it is, right? And so, I am, um, so for me, I can't, I actually find it hard to see things unless I know materially how things work. Um, uh, and so, and so it, it depends, the different chapters in the book will be different depending on, my relationship with the artist, but a lot of it really starts with that um, understanding of the material conditions and the problems, the conceptual, and I write about a lot of artists who make very immaterial things or dematerialized things, right, too, as well. But the at least the material or conceptual questions that they were trying to answer, and then and then sort of go from there. But yeah, I think I always try, I I think that my process, if I was going to sort of give it a name, I would just say that it's like very close listening, to whatever I'm able to listen to, whether that's artist letters or studio visits or whatever it is. It's just really close listening. Um, yeah.
Thank you. Does maybe
Yeah.
one last question?
There's someone here.
Hi, thank
Hi.
you. I'm wondering about, so the majority, not all, but the majority of the artists that you talked about are showing primarily in gallery spaces, or at least in the photos that you provided.
Oh, yes.
So I'm wondering about, as part of thinking about an ethic in someone's creative practice, if you could speak to like alternate venues.
Sure. So, it it's yeah, I mean, in a way, this is a lot of these artists or artists that I've had the opportunity to delve into their work, and often those opportunities are offered by galleries and institutions, right? But I think as well that what that there are um that that I'm interested in a lot of artist curated projects that exist outside of traditional gallery spaces, and one that I especially love, that I wrote about for the New York Times, was two curators, Chinese American, one Chinese American, who happened to be married, curators, both of whom are artists as well, who went to a strip mall in Flushing, Queens, right? Like these strip malls are like one story kind of little, you go in and there's like a hallway and there's like, a, a butcher and a jewelry store and a travel agent and a barber and a dollar store and whatever. And they used to be all over Flushing, right? And they're very common in, I think, you see them in a lot of like Chinese majority kind of places, right? Hong Kong and what, or you used to. But they're sort of, as real estate development happens, they're disappearing more and more. But they tend to be hubs for new immigrants to come and find housing, find jobs, stuff like that. And these curators got a group of artists together. They curated a show in one of these remaining strip malls in Flushing, and so and they did it in a way that didn't transform the space, but kind of gently entered into the space, right? So like, one artist had work that was interspersed with the room for rent, or not even room for rent, right? Bed for rent, or, minimum wage delivery job signs, right? And her work was really like focused on these like, sort of, um, it was song lyrics, and it was about communicating kind of love and care for whoever was reading the signs. You went inside, there's a great artist whose name I'm totally blanking on, and I'm really sorry about this, but he's a artist in China who uh is not in his life in China, no one knows he's gay, but he makes these very beautiful cut paper works that have to do with his life as a gay man. And those were hanging along with other, kind of commercially made cut paper works hanging, so it was a kind of way in which the work wasn't taking over. It wasn't gentrifying, it wasn't like turning this space into an art space. It was actually just interacting with the space in a way that I thought was very beautiful. And I interviewed the people who worked in the different stores and the store owners and things like that, because negotiating, sort of creating this, getting permission to do this and create, getting buy-in from all the people was part of the curatorial process. And it was great. People who have never been understood to be important enough to be an art audience, they had opinions, right? Like they were like, yeah, this is our exhibition, right? Like we get to have a say in this as well. And so, I think that projects like that, have been, really, I'm very moved by them, so that's one that I can sort of point to. Yeah. Yes. Thank you. That's the artist. Yeah, thank you. But yes, and his work is being shown more and more. Like, I think it's very beautiful, and very sort of harrowing at the same time because of the kind of secrecy around it. Yeah. Okay.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Aruna. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Thank you.